Silence. You think it means peace, don't you? But what if I told you the quietest ones are often the most dangerous? That behind every calm nod and withheld word, lies a calculation. Silence isn't always the absence of noise, sometimes, it's the presence of intent. And in the realm of dark psychology, silence can be louder than screams. You've been taught to believe silence is passive, polite, peaceful. That those who remain quiet are simply shy, introverted, maybe even afraid. But this belief is naive. In the shadowy corridors of human psychology, silence is anything but harmless. For those who understand the mechanics of power, the currency of influence isn't always words, it's the lack of them. Silence, when wielded with intent, isn't a signal of weakness. It's a weapon. Sharper than any blade, and more unnerving than any scream. Consider the conversations you've had, the arguments where words were your defense, your sword, your scream for justice, and the other person just watched. No reaction. No response. Just quiet. That silence wasn't ignorance. It was strategy. The most manipulative individuals know that withholding a response makes you uncomfortable. Humans are social creatures, our brains are wired to interpret silence as rejection, confusion, or worst of all, judgment. We scramble to fill the void with more words, over-explanations, apologies we haven't fully thought through. And in doing so, we expose more. We give them the information they need to truly own the game. This is the psychology of the interrogator who lets silence stretch after a denial. The suspect starts talking again, desperate to explain. Progress is made in the stillness, not the aggression. Or think of the toxic parent who offers you the silent treatment. Their quiet isn't passivity. It's punishment. Silence becomes the dagger that slowly cuts you from the inside, making you believe you've done something deeply, terribly wrong, even if you haven't. In dark psychological dynamics, the most powerful person in a room is usually the one speaking the least. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they know that information is power, and the less they give, the more control they keep. By holding back words, they create a vacuum. One that others frantically try to fill. The silent individual appears composed, in control, unbothered. The truth, more often than not, is far darker. They might be calculating. Measuring reactions. Finding your emotional pressure points with every fidget and word you spill to break their muteness. This strategy isn't new. Cult leaders, narcissists, professional negotiators, even interrogators in psychological warfare, all use controlled silence as a power tactic. In negotiation, pausing in silence after a proposal can pressure the other party into second-guessing their offer, often conceding more than they intended. In relationships, silence morphs into guilt and emotional dependency, forcing one partner to earn back the connection. In abusive dynamics, silence is a leash you can't see, but you feel it pulling at your sanity. The real genius of weaponized silence lies in its plausible deniability. When you're being yelled at, you can scream back. When you're being hit, you can run. But how do you fight what isn't said? How do you defend yourself against the absence of sound? The reality is chilling, you can't. Not easily. Not without first understanding that silence isn't always the absence of communication. Many times, it is the message. A very loud, very deliberate message that you are not worth the speaker's time, energy, or acknowledgement. And that message can destroy self-esteem far more efficiently than 1,000 cruel words ever could. But here's where it gets truly dark: those who use silence as a weapon often do so with surgical precision. They know when to speak and when to remain quiet, not randomly but with purpose. When they see that your anxiety peaks at their silence, they keep doing it. When they notice you begin apologizing just to stop the unbearable quiet, they understand they've won. It's control through inaction, one of the most potent forms of manipulation because it's invisible, almost unprovable. You end up doubting yourself: maybe I'm overthinking, maybe they're just tired. But deep down, a part of you knows it's more than that. It's orchestrated. Cold. Calculated. So the next time you're in a moment of silence, ask yourself, is it peaceful, or is it tactical? Because in the world of dark psychology, a closed mouth doesn't mean an empty mind. Sometimes it means the darkest thoughts are being formed, not expressed. Sometimes the silence is louder than any scream you've ever heard. In a world obsessed with disclosure, validation, and compulsive self-expression, those who intentionally withhold become the most unpredictable, and therefore, the most powerful. The act of holding back, whether it's words, emotions, approval, or even simple information, is not neutral. It is deliberate. Calculated. In the hands of someone who understands the darker side of human behavior, it becomes manipulation in its purest form. You see, communication is often assumed to be a two-way street. A natural exchange of ideas and emotions, mutual and open. But for those who maneuver within the shadows of psychology, conversation is warfare, and sometimes, the most strategic move you can make is not to play. Those who understand the power of withholding know one simple truth: when you give nothing, people project everything. Their fears. Their hopes. Their guilt. Their insecurities. All of it pours into the silence you've created, and suddenly, you have influence without effort. It starts as a hesitation. A pause before answering. A slight reluctance to compliment. They say less than they know. Offer less than they feel. Withhold approval until you're begging for it. They don't give information freely, instead, they let you give yours, over and over, until they hold your secrets while you know nothing of theirs. The balance of power is now in their favor, they are the vault, and you are the open book. You wonder why they're hard to read. That's the point. The less they reveal, the more you chase. Mystery becomes magnetism. And when confusion is weaponized, control is absolute. The subtle cruelty of this tactic is hard to resist. Think of someone who shows interest, then suddenly retreats. Leaves a message on read. Pulls away emotionally, not with anger, but with eerie calm. This is not indecisiveness. It's psychological choreography. The withdrawer knows your brain will obsess over the unanswered question. Silence creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates obsession. Now, you're performing for the approval they've withheld, not because it was denied, but because it was never offered. You're trying to decode something that was never meant to be clear. And the more you try, the deeper you fall into their construct. Withholding isn't just arrogant silence. It's also about controlling timing. The manipulator may give you truth, but only when it serves them. They may confess something significant, but only after you've exposed yourself fully, making their revelation feel generous, when in reality, it's a chess move. When they display vulnerability, it's not because they trust you, it's because they calculated you were ripe for control. It's not emotion, it's leverage. And it's weaponized like a sniper uses a scope, distanced, deliberate, and deadly. Imagine a partner who always stops short of giving you reassurance. Who responds to your vulnerability with vague affection, nothing concrete. You find yourself unraveling, not because there's violence or chaos, but because there's just enough withholding to keep your emotional hunger alive. This is not an accident. It is control through craving. There is also withholding in leadership, in friendships, in families. A boss who refuses to give clear expectations but punishes anyway. A friend who pulls back affection when you're succeeding, making you wonder if you've done something wrong. A parent who gives love inconsistently, so the child grows up chasing every scrap of attention, molding themselves in whatever shape is needed, just to get a reaction. Over time, this emotional starvation becomes normal. Even addictive. It is the illusion of connection, mixed with intermittent rejection. This combination is the breeding ground for trauma bonds and long-term psychological dependence, not in spite of the withholding, but because of it. And here lies T. So when someone withholds what we need, comfort, validation, answers, our brain doesn't register indifference. It registers threat. That threat of danger becomes a hook. And that hook keeps us coming back for more, trying endlessly to gain what they refuse to give. This is what makes the act of withholding so toxic, and so effective. It doesn't feel overtly abusive. It's quiet. Unprovable. Like a glass wall you can see through but can't walk past. The person who withholds stays above confrontation. They say, "I never said anything cruel," and technically they're right. They simply didn't say what you needed, what you deserved, what you were pleading to receive. It's the abuse no one believes, because it leaves no scars, only silence. That is the genius of dark psychology, understanding not just what people want, but what they're afraid to lose. And then never giving it, never fully, just enough to keep you under their spell. There is a reason interrogators, cult leaders, and emotional abusers all share one common tool in their psychological arsenal: silence. Not the peaceful, meditative kind. Not the respectful pause. This is the kind of silence that chokes the air out of a conversation. That swells with judgment, ambiguity, and power. When used with intention, silence is not absence, it is dominance. Measured, unsettling, and deeply controlling. It doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need to explain. It simply exists, and in that existence, it warps the psychology of everyone trapped in it. Most people experience silence as a void that must be filled. It feels unnatural, largely because human beings are wired for communication and validation. When that connection is disrupted, even temporarily, we instinctively interpret the silence as rejection or punishment. Someone pauses after we speak. Our minds race. Did I say something wrong? Did they disagree? Are they angry with me? This reaction isn't weakness, it's conditioning. Silence in social situations sends unconscious signals of emotional threat. And threats force adaptation. Those who understand this dynamic don't need to raise their voice to gain control. They sit in silence while others squirm under the pressure. They withhold their reactions, wait out your anxiety, and let you reveal all your cards just to break the unbearable stillness they've created. You start apologizing for what you didn't do. You soften your tone, backtrack, or over-explain. They say almost nothing, but suddenly, they have all the power. This is how fear begins. Not the loud kind. Not the type triggered by yelling, insults, or threats. But the slower, deeper kind, the fear that grows in confusion. The fear of not knowing where you stand with someone. When that fear is driven by silence, it's disorienting. There's nothing to react against. Nothing to argue with. You can't combat what hasn't been said. And so, you do the only thing you can, you conform. You begin walking on eggshells, softening your words, predicting their moods, rehearsing your behavior. You surrender not because you were defeated, but because the silence eroded your certainty. And stripped of certainty, obedience becomes survival. This tactic doesn't only appear in personal relationships. It thrives in toxic workplaces, families, and power-imbalanced institutions. A supervisor makes a disapproving face but says nothing. A teacher gives a cold stare after a correct answer. A parent punishes with days of silent treatment instead of words. These calculated silences create an invisible punishment, one that forces others to self-correct without ever being told what they did wrong. That's the terrifying brilliance of it. The person in control says nothing, and yet, somehow, you're the one who changes. Fear, once planted, leads to obedience. Not by demand, but by anticipation. You begin to work for the tiniest sign of approval, the smallest gesture of warmth. When someone has withheld for so long, the briefest moment of softness becomes addictive. It feels like sunshine after endless cold, irresistible, but also unstable. Never guaranteed. And so, like a mouse in a lab craving a random food pellet, you return again and again, hoping for a reward that only comes when they choose. This is how people become psychologically trained. It's no longer about what's fair or right, it's about how you can avoid that silence. How you can stay in the warmth of their attention. How not to be shut out again. In this emotional economy, silence becomes a kind of currency, miserly distributed, deeply valued, and tightly controlled. And still, the most disturbing part of all is how effective this is. You don't realize it's happening until you're too far gone. Until you find yourself apologizing for things you didn't do, or anxiously overthinking texts and glances. Until you hear yourself minimizing your needs just to avoid another wall of silence. Until your self-worth becomes contingent on how loud or silent someone else decides to be. That's when obedience becomes internalized. That's when silence isn't just a manipulation tactic, it becomes your master. In the wrong hands, silence is not passive. It is not peace. It is psychological pressure, invisible punishment, and emotional domination, all wrapped in a cloak of stillness. It doesn't attack the body. It attacks the identity. It tricks the mind into policing itself. And sooner or later, if you don't recognize it for what it is, you'll follow its commands with no memory of ever being told what to do. In dark psychology, silence doesn't just breed fear. It manufactures compliance. Not through force, but through the slow, quiet erosion of resistance. Not every narcissist is loud. Not every manipulator screams. In fact, some of the most dangerous ones don't raise their voice at all. They don't need to. Their silence speaks for them, and often, it's louder than any insult could ever be. These are the silent narcissists, calm, composed, and coldly calculating. They practice cruelty not through chaos, but through a chilling form of control. One that's almost invisible. One that feels like emotional torture, without ever leaving a mark. The silent narcissist doesn't throw plates. They don't explode with rage in front of a crowd. No. Instead, they punish you with the most psychologically destabilizing weapon imaginable: withdrawal. Detachment. Disconnection. They press mute on the emotional channel, and in that deliberate quiet, you begin to unravel. And that's exactly what they want. This isn't silence by accident. It isn't about conflict avoidance or emotional fatigue. This is silence as a statement. A weaponized absence. It serves as both judge and jury. It tells you, you no longer matter. You've stepped out of line. And now I will let you feel what it's like to be erased, slowly. It is a form of psychological exile, a slow burn that pushes you to seek their validation at any cost. And it works, because silence from a narcissist isn't just empty air, it's a strategic vacuum. It pulls you into an obsessive loop of self-doubt. What did I do wrong? Are they okay? Why won't they talk to me? Should I apologize again? Suddenly, you shift from reacting to real harm to inventing your own guilt, simply to make the silence stop. That's how deeply this tactic penetrates. It convinces you that abuse is your fault. But that's the whole point. The silent narcissist doesn't want communication, they want domination. They want you crawling back, begging, apologizing for sins they never even named. When they withdraw affection, responsiveness, or engagement, it pushes you into what psychologists call emotional starvation. And humans, wired to seek connection and safety, don't endure that quietly. So you begin to trade your boundaries for their attention. Your self-respect for their approval. And you don't even realize it, because their silence has built a prison with no bars, just a desperate need for resolution. You ask. You cry. You argue. You reach. But none of it moves them, because their silence is your punishment. And their attention is the reward you never fully earn. Everything about this cycle is designed for imbalance. Picture this: you receive warmth, love, and validation, but inconsistently. You never know when it's coming, or what triggers its withdrawal. The narcissist gives you just enough to keep you invested, and then disappears emotionally when it matters most. This cycle of idealize, devalue, and discard is the architecture of narcissistic abuse, and silence is its most loyal engineer. Eventually, you begin to silence yourself. You think twice before asking questions. You suppress your true feelings. You censor your reactions. Not because they told you to, but because their silence trained you to fear losing proximity to them. You have been conditioned not by words, but by their absence. This is what makes the silent narcissist so dangerous. They don't need to raise their hand or voice, they create fear through emotional removal, which is far more insidious. Their silence appears mature, stoic, even reasonable to outsiders. That's why victims are rarely believed. They just needed some space, people say. Or, they're quiet, that doesn't mean they're abusive. But what those people can't see is the psychological warfare waged in that silence. The anxiety it creates, the shame it breeds, the control it exerts. Because when you're locked in a relationship defined by intermittent silence, your nervous system becomes hijacked. You live on edge, not knowing whether connection or emotional exile is coming next. And here lies the final cruelty. When the narcissist finally does speak again, it's not to resolve the conflict, it's to minimize it. To gaslight you. To remind you that you're the overly emotional one. To make their silence seem like your punishment for not being easy to love. They re-enter the conversation as the calm, centered one, while you're shaking inside. It's mental reversal. You went looking for peace, and somehow ended up apologizing for wanting clarity. Again. This is emotional torture of the most deceptive kind. A manipulation tactic that relies on your need to be understood. It exploits your vulnerability, not with volume, but with complete detachment. It leaves no bruises, just broken trust, hollow self-worth, and the painful memory of screams you were never allowed to let out. In dark psychology, silence isn't empty. It's full, of power, of calculation, of punishment. And when used by a narcissist, it becomes the quiet art of control, perfected. They don't yell. They don't boast. They barely speak. And that's what makes them so dangerous. The most lethal individuals, in relationships, leadership, or manipulation, are rarely the loudest in the room. They are the ones who sit back, observe, and wait. You might miss them entirely. At first glance, they seem calm, perhaps quiet, reserved, harmless even. But what you're seeing is not humility or kindness. What you're seeing is calculated restraint. This is the silent predator archetype, someone who uses silence not because they lack something to say, but because they're measuring, analyzing, hunting. They're watching your emotions, your mistakes, your reactions. Every word you speak becomes a page in the book they're writing about you, a manual for your manipulation later. And you won't know you're being studied until the moment they move, when they act with impunity and precision, as if they already knew how you'd respond. The average person speaks to connect. The silent predator listens to control. They speak when it's to their advantage, and they stay quiet when it's more strategic to do so. Silence, to them, is not a gap in communication, it's a territorial claim. It's a psycholinguistic maneuver. They know that in most human interactions, silence is uncomfortable. People rush to fill it, often by revealing more than they should. That's what the predator counts on, your nervousness. Your need for reassurance. Your desire to interpret what their silence might mean. You ask a question, they don't answer. You share something emotional, they go blank. You expect a reaction, and they give you nothing. That nothingness is not carelessness. It's control. Because you start reacting to them, not the other way around. You begin adjusting your tone, your behavior, your position, all based on how they've chosen to withhold theirs. That's how they flip the dynamic. And they do it quietly. It's not what they give. It's what they don't. This absence forces you into a psychological loop, trying to predict their thinking, decoding their silence, overanalyzing their motives when all you're given is that cold, unreadable calm. The silent predator doesn't just manipulate your words, they manipulate your mind. They get inside, and once there, they let you do the work of breaking yourself down. Unlike overt abusers, they don't need to openly humiliate or threaten. Their genius lies in subtlety. A slow withdrawal. A strategically timed smirk. A long pause before they answer. A non-response designed to make you overthink. They're the ones who can make a room feel tense simply by being in it, because even their stillness is oppressive, calculated. There's something haunting about people who speak so little, yet make everyone around them feel scrutinized and vulnerable. And perhaps the most dangerous feature of the silent predator is patience. They aren't impulsive. They can track your behavior for weeks, months, silently gathering data. They'll mirror your preferences to gain trust. They'll fake empathy, ask the right questions, play the role. But all the while, they're not bonding with you, they're building a blueprint of your emotional mechanics. They hold back, not because they don't care, but because they care about control above all else. Eventually, they strike. It might be a highly calculated betrayal, a public humiliation, or a private psychological dismantling. And when they finally act, it feels like they've known exactly how to hurt you all along, because they have. Your biggest fears, your secret shame, your insecurities, you thought they didn't notice. But they did. Every time you opened up while they stayed silent, they were collecting weapons. And you were handing them over. The scariest part isn't just the damage they cause, it's how prepared they are to cause it. Unlike impulsive manipulators who act out in the heat of emotion, the silent predator plans. They don't waste words, and they don't waste attacks. They strike when you're most exposed. When it's least expected. And their silence will be the last thing you remember before everything collapses, because you'll realize that every moment of quiet was a step toward your undoing. This archetype is terrifying not because they're loud, but because they make silence echo. They make you need their attention, fear their approval, and obsess over their unreadable expression. And even after they leave, you'll still hear silence, not real silence, but the psychological kind that keeps you questioning everything you thought was real. In dark psychology, the silent predator isn't passive. They are precise, predatory, and almost invisible until they don't need to be anymore. And by then, it's already too late.